Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here to talk about a really exciting topic. I have a number of powerhouses who I'm going to call up with me to join me in a moment. But first, I just wanted to thank you for coming and participating today. This is a very important conversation for Canada and for BC, but it's an important conversation to have for the world. As is mentioned, I work at the Beedie School of Business and at SFU, and I'm the Director of Entrepreneurship there. But today, I'm going to have a different hat on. So, as some of you will know, this summer, the federal government convened a group of 9 plus me people around Canada to convene groups of thought leaders and the Canadian public to inform the innovation agenda that Minister Baines was talking about this morning. And Minister Baines, in collaboration with Minister Chagger and Minister Duncan and a number of other high-ranking government officials, have put together this innovation agenda with a lot of input from Canadian stakeholders. And that's important because, as I think everyone in this room knows, innovation is rarely a top-down process, because innovation is something that is driven by passion and is driven by people, and also that innovators are very hard to control. So, a few takeaways I'd like to share are, first off, this is not going to surprise anyone in the room, that talent is mission critical. And it doesn't matter who you talk about or what you talk about, that's important. That, particularly important to this conversation, social good and economic good do not have to run in opposite directions. No one here thinks enough money is enough money for what they do. Everyone here thinks they need more money. And being an innovation nation is going to take systems change. It's not just going to take us putting money in what we're already doing. And one thing I wanted us to think about that I added later because I was listening to Ian is one of the things that came out of these collaborations was that Canada probably needs a little bit more swagger, that we're a little bit too quiet about what we do. And I think given the numbers that came out today and the minister was talking about, we all have a reason to swagger a little bit more. So if we can be a little louder and a little more confident, I think that'll do this sector a lot of good. But one of the most important takeaways for today was we have to decide on what our brand of innovation is. Can we leverage what we already are and become a place to solve problems that matter to Canada and to the world? Can we become a place to solve problems that matter, and how? And this leads me to our session today. Cleantech and how to get to market with a bit of a cluster lens, and that's particularly given the current federal and provincial discussions. BC has been called one of the top 10 clean tech clusters in the world. By others, it's been called a nascent cluster. By others, it's called a cluster of clusters of related technologies. But it's largely agreed that this sector shows a lot of promise and a lot of momentum if we can capitalize on it. So as Minister Baines said this morning, the global market for clean tech is supposed to be around $3 trillion by 2020. BC is poised to take a significant share, and clean tech has created more than 13,000 jobs here, and they're all good-paying jobs, or many of them are good-paying jobs. But another reason this is so important is because the kind of knowledge and activity that clean tech lends and creates, it goes by a very specific and technical name of sticky. And that is, it's harder to package and move, which leads to regional competitive advantage and growth. So we have set the stage to be a global powerhouse, but it's fine to set that high-level conversation. The more interesting conversation is, how are we going to do that? And for that, we've gathered together a diverse micro-cluster just for this stage. So I'll let our panelists introduce themselves a little bit more fully, but first, representing more established firms, we have Robert Artibise, Corporate Development Manager of Automotive Fuel Cell Corporation, Cooperation Corp, if he could come up. Don't know where he, oh, perfect. Representing the investment community, we have Sarah Applebaum, Director of Pangaea Spark, Pangaea Ventures. Representing startups, Benjamin Britton, co-founder and CEO of SFU Chemistry spin-out Ionomr. Representing the science and tech research community, we have Walter Merida, Director of CERC, Clean Energy Research Center, UBC. And representing Advanced Science Research and Commercialization, Dr. Elicia, Maine, Academic Director, Science and Tech Commercialization at the Beedie School of Business at SFU. So what I'm going to encourage for a fairly lively panel is that the panelists not only respond to my questions, but also please take time to respond to each other as well. And then we will get to taking questions from the audience. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction that gets to the heart of why you're here. I'd like to ask each panelist to briefly introduce yourself and include your favorite example of something that's being done in cleantech in BC that deserves praise, or what our claim to fame could be.
Okay, first off, my name's Robert Artibise. I'm the corporate manager at Automotive Fuel Cell Cooperation. Automotive Fuel Cell Cooperation is about 230 employees focusing on developing automotive fuel cells. We're a joint company owned by Mercedes-Benz and Ford Motor Company. And then to your second part of your question is, what am I most?
It's a good example of what we do well here.
Oh, okay, good example. Well, obviously, with some of the things that people have mentioned about the KPMG report today, BC only being 9% of the population in Canada, but 30% of the revenue in cleantech, I think is really impressive. It's $1.7 billion, I believe, that comes into the province annually, and I think that's we should really be a little bit proud about that. Like you said, increase our swagger. And I really appreciate the whole kind of cluster environment that's kind of forming here. I know I meet Walter here probably 4, 5, 6 times a year, and many of the people, many of the faces in here, we meet not only at Globe, not only at the Tech Summit, but in the industry and meetings quite often. And I think that really shares ideas, and I guess I'm proud of that as well.
Awesome. Fantastic.
Great, thanks. I'm Sarah Applebaum with Pangaea Ventures. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pangaea, we are a venture capital firm that focuses on companies that have material science, chemistry, or biology innovations at the core of what they do, which enables us to do a lot. We basically will look at any technology as long as it's not digital or therapeutics and pharmaceuticals, and we focus on 4 main market sectors: energy, electronics, health, and sustainability. Health for us also includes agriculture and water-related technologies. We've been doing this for about 15 plus years now. We just did a first close of our 4th fund in December and are actively deploying capital into both early stage seed companies as well as companies that have demonstrated commercial traction and product revenue. We also are a little bit uniquely positioned to help our portfolio companies interact with customers and access new markets, because all of our capital comes from strategic investors, some of the world's largest chemical and industrial companies that we have the pleasure of working with that are based all around the globe. And in terms of my vision for what British Columbia can be from a clean tech perspective and a broader technology perspective is not a regional player or a national player, but a global one. And I think that's really how we need to think about how we want to develop our technologies and our communities and our businesses to be really poised for growth. You know, we're really fortunate to not only be here in Vancouver and in Western Canada and a strong player, but, you know, 2.5-hour flight from Silicon Valley and where there's a lot of capital, but also easy access point to Asia. And I think we need to look outwardly for both exporting our technology, importing talent, and importing new ideas as well.
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Ben Britton, co-founder and CEO of Ionomr. As Sarah said, a recent SFU spin-out based on 2 fundamental advantages in membrane chemistry. So we manufacture the world's most advanced ion exchange membranes, which will be revolutionary for many applications in water treatment, clean energy storage, and clean energy generation. And what I think BC's claim to fame should be, and what it is really, is that it is the world hub of electrochemistry applications, with deep roots back to Ballard and the National Research Council Institute for Fuel Cell Innovation. And I think we really should have swagger for that, because there's so much talent here and it's all been thoroughly developed.
Good afternoon, my name is Walter Merida. I'm the director of the Clean Energy Research Center at the University of British Columbia. And UBC is the first university in Canada that had greenhouse gas emission targets. We reached the Kyoto targets in 2007, ahead of schedule. And since then, we have reduced emissions on the Vancouver campus by 33%, while at the same time, we have grown 20% in the student population and 16% in built environment. So this challenge of growth with concurrent greenhouse gas emissions reductions is, I think, a challenge that's shared around the world. And to your question about what BC is doing well, this afternoon rather, Bill Tam said that innovation is combining the art of the possible with the art of the now, what's possible now. Minister Baines has also indicated that there are 3 key ingredients for innovation: talent, capital, and technology. I think BC is doing very well on the technology and talent side, especially in the wake of this week's announcements. I think we can do more in the terms of attracting the capital. But in terms of the brand, I think one of the things, to go back to your comment about the swagger, I think one of the things we have going for us right now is in part due to what the federal government has done internationally, we have a very strong brand internationally. And the good news is that in addition to the brand, the birthplace of carbon taxes in North America, Google, and the whole West Coast, we also have the goods to deliver on that brand.
Nice. I'm Elicia, Maine. I'm a professor of innovation and entrepreneurship at Simon Fraser University, and also the academic director of an innovative graduate program for scientists and engineers who want to commercialize their technology. So it can be people who want to do it in the short term and start a venture with something that they've been working on in the lab, that they have a patent or they have some tangible inventions, or it can be different scientists and engineers and postdocs who want to be better able to contribute to the Vancouver innovation ecosystem, the BC innovation ecosystem, through being able to reach into universities and recognize what could be promising for new product development in their company. So that's our goal, is to contribute to the innovation ecosystem. We've had 2 cohorts of this program run, and we're finding some the things that postdocs and PhD students and a faculty member even have brought in have been challenges that would not have easy access to funding usually, that are addressing some of the big global challenges, and particularly in the clean tech space. And as to what to praise for BC, I think we, as was mentioned this morning, we punch above our weight in invention, no question. We're now punching above our weight nationally in the percentage of the clean tech sector that we're growing and developing here. And I think we have the potential for a lot more for the reasons that were mentioned here today.
Brilliant, thank you. So I guess what I'll go to next is flipping that question on its head. So despite this promise, we know we rock, we know why we should have swagger. What do you think BC needs in order to realize its full potential in clean tech?
Sorry, can you state the question?
What does BC need in order to realize its full potential in clean tech?
So I represent a part of, well, I don't represent the transportation sector, but my company is looking at the transportation sector. And transportation accounts for about 30% of the greenhouse gases produced. Surface transportation or ground transportation is 50% of those greenhouse gases. And so while we've set carbon emission targets, I haven't, or I'm still waiting to hear a strategy from the government, all levels, so civic, provincial, and federal, of what's our strategy in Canada going to be. So I would like to see some of that. I totally agree with Sarah. We're a global company. A lot of our products are in Japan and in California, United States, other places in the world, in Asia. But we're not using our products at home as much as we should. So I'd like to see the adopting our products locally. And I think for that we need a little carrot and stick approach from our federal government.
Interesting, thank you.
So what do we need to do regionally to reach our full potential in clean tech? I think that depends on who's asking the question and how you define what our full potential is. Representing sort of the more financial institution side of the equation, we would define success as having high growth potential companies that are successful not only in creating jobs and growing the economy and selling product from a revenue perspective, but also are acquired at high multiples or have the ability to go public. That's sort of my metric, but if the metric we want to look at is job creation or innovation or carbon sequestration or clean water, it just depends who you ask and what that looks like.
Thanks.
I'm going to echo what my colleague from the FCC said, and we need someone to pull the trigger on the clean energy economy. If you look at the Department of Energy numbers, everything is cost competitive with current solutions, even with oil at $50 a barrel. We do have, for instance, for hydrogen electrolysis, in the last 10 years, the basic cost of it has come down 60%. We are on a tipping point, I think, and someone needs to pull the trigger.
Who would that someone be? Would that be government, industry,
So who would that be?
private capital?
It would be large companies and industry and government together need to make this decision. The US Department of Energy really is the people, the person that everyone, or the entity that everyone looks to for this, but I do believe that we can do this independently in Canada.
Well, I think that's a great segue into what I would add is that the title of our panel is the market pool. And there's no clearer market pool than the low carbon economy market pool. If you have been following the last conference of parties in Paris and Marrakesh in the last couple of years, there have been two really interesting developments. The first is the 2-degree target that was agreed upon in Paris. More than 100 countries have now ratified that. But at the last one in Marrakesh, the number that came out, and the one that was a bit surprising to me, was the 40 trillion number. And that's the amount of investment that will be required to change our energy system in the next 2 or 3 decades, which is what we have if we want to have an impact by 2030. So while we should, of course, follow and try to react to the government's welcome initiatives on climate, we shouldn't lose track of what's going on globally. The Paris Agreement was a political breakthrough for sure, but there were 3 other developments that were equally significant. The emergence of the Breakthrough Energy Coalition led by Bill Gates, that's planning to deploy billions of dollars per year, tens of billions of dollars per year. Mission Innovation, which is 23 countries, Canada is part of that, is planning to deploy 30 billion per year by 2021, I believe. And the last one, which is very interesting and which I think triggered the participation of a lot of multinational energy companies at the last COP, was the new task force that was set up within the Financial Stability Board, which incidentally is chaired by Mark Carney, who used to run the Bank of Canada and is now running the Bank of England. That task force is led by Michael Bloomberg, the ex-mayor of New York, and that task force is looking at climate exposure risk from corporations. So a lot of the large multinational energy companies are already using carbon pricing in their own project development. So I think we have an opportunity to align ourselves with those new opportunities, because while the 100 millions that Adrian needs for his plant may be accessible through venture capital or government funding, I think the new opportunities are very much larger. These new entities are the first step. The next investor class that I think is going to be activated is the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, which combine, we had the ambassador of Norway yesterday, the Norwegian pension fund is now $1.2 trillion, and they are looking for places to place some of that capital to invest.
So I'd say the metric, we're talking about what metrics we look at to assess, whether we're meeting our goals as a successful clean tech ecosystem. And, I would go with the idea of solving global challenges that, climate change, clean water, clean air, and as well, being able to seed jobs and grow jobs as we're being measured right now in this recent report of having 30% of the clean tech jobs in Canada, and good paying jobs. So both of those metrics are the ones that I would look at. And I'd quote the president of MIT, Raphael Reif, who is taking a real leadership position on what universities can do, what they're good at, and the kind of invention that they have within the labs of the research scientists and engineers, who says, for some of the greatest challenges that we have facing our world and facing humanity, amongst them, the clean tech challenges, there's no app for that. That there's a responsibility to be able to, for universities and at a large scale, because we as institutions are very good at corralling academics and very smart graduate students to harness their energy on breakthrough inventions. And so being able, here in BC, we have all of that capability. And what can we do to take a role in gathering the jobs in this clean tech economy and being a world leader, building on the history of that's been done here in BC over the last couple of decades? Well, we can have more programs, more direct programs that are both trying to pull technologies to market through very good programs like the SDC Tech Fund, which is looking at those grand challenges and then trying to match startup ventures with larger players throughout the innovation value chain. Programs like the new BCIC Ignite, which again is focusing on pre-commercial technologies and trying to get them to scale, and programs like the things that are coming out of Foresight and the innovation challenges, the Arctic program. So we could do more of that, to the point that Ben made. The US does do a lot more through ARPA and through the SBIR programs, and we need to seriously consider that.
Is there another answer, or are we just starting down the line again?
We're just starting.
Oh, okay. So Elicia already started talking about this a little bit, but clusters often get defined by technology. We're talking about clean tech, and yet an article out of Cambridge on clustering suggested that you really get collaboration when you focus on a problem, not tech. So is this something that we're doing in BC? Is this something we can leverage, or is there something we need to do better? Because one of the things that we heard across the country when we were talking about clusters and talking about innovation was that a lot of Canadian companies know more what's going on in Boston and Silicon Valley than what's going on down the street. So I'm happy for you to disagree with me on that one, but I'm curious, is there a way for us to act more like a cluster? Is there more things we need to do?
So I'll just use your example from transportation. Transportation is 40% of the emissions in British Columbia. So from an environmental point of view, we need to do something about transportation. So in the last 18 months, we have run a series of workshops that engage the sector. And we have developed 2 national consortia, one on urban transit, which is now deploying some demonstration projects in Ontario, and hopefully some in Western Canada. And we have another one on the natural gas. So I was really glad to hear the presentation from General Electric about the connection of digitizing the resource sector, because I think there are tremendous opportunities in that. So absolutely, one of the things I think that I would like to emphasize is that innovation is not just about the tech. It's about best practices and also training. So my center, for example, partnered with the local utilities, gas and electricity utilities, to develop a curriculum. And we developed the first Masters of Clean Energy Engineering program in Canada. And we have been offering that since 2009. And we really went to the sector to listen to what the skill set that they wanted in the professionals for the next couple of decades was. And then we developed the curriculum. And that has been extremely successful. We have now cloned that program into 7 more programs for different forestry, bioproducts, urban systems, etc. So I just wanted to give that example because it's not just about the gadget and the tech, it's also the business models. To go back to your point about the advances in electrochemical energy conversion, that's to me another clear pull. Most of the renewable energy technologies can only generate electricity, and we cannot store the electricity in large quantities. I was very interested to hear about again, the transition from MRI to wind towers. Maybe we can transfer that also to superconducting magnetic storage, energy storage, because that's one of the key barriers. So there are some clear pulls, but it's not just the technology. We need to really have this dialogue, and that's another competitive advantage thing in BC, because as Robert said, we meet regularly. Adrian and I went to school together, so it's a very small community in BC that we can take advantage of.
Well, I'm going to say I fall 90% in supporting the cluster and 10% in supporting solving problems. Emissions Reduction Alberta, what is now Emissions Reduction Alberta, runs grand challenges. And that has actually been successful in stimulating innovation out of universities. So a recent startup out of UBC, Chemical Engineering, Mangrove Energy Technologies, actually has been funded $3 million in the last month through this grand challenge. And they're gone from a research lab into a company in a hurry.
So I think what was said a little bit earlier is really important about highlighting what our competitive advantages are, but I think we also need to think about what the outputs of the clusters are and who consumes them. So that would be sort of the real industry pull. If you think of, and I can't take any credit for this analogy, a cluster as a bit of a sweet treat. It's like you got some nuts and some caramel and some nougat and some chocolate. Who's going to be eating that that chocolate at the end of the day? And why? And how are they going to be satisfied and why? And so, we have these great competitive advantages in clean technology and innovation and research and electrochemistry and this great talent here in Vancouver and in the province of British Columbia, but what is the output and who wants to consume it, and are we sure that it's relevant? And I think we need to ask that question and involve industry in those conversations, not just domestic industry, but a more global focus to make sure that we really hit the nail on the head.
Can we ask questions amongst each other?
Let's find out
Fair enough.
what that looks like.
Sarah, I wanted to know if you'd comment on, with Pangaea, when you look at investing in the early stage firms that are doing clean tech challenges, when you look at the American firms versus the Canadian firms, is there a big difference for you there? And if so, why, in terms of the non-dilutive financing they've had?
So in terms of access to capital and government grants and non-dilutive financing, I don't think there is a marked difference between Canada and the US in terms of what capital the companies have had access to get their technologies out of the lab, validate some of the research, and sort of have an MVP ready to talk to customers and investors. I think the two biggest differences, and I'm not going to say anything new here about early stage companies in Canada versus the United States, are twofold. One is how the founders and entrepreneurs look at markets. Generally, here in Canada, and this is not British Columbia specific, we tend to be a little bit more inward, thinking about our local and domestic markets as opposed to international. And second is often the ask is a lot bigger in the US. It's, here's how I want to tackle this big problem, and we need $10 million to do it, versus I think I can make a little bit of a difference with just a couple $100,000. And it's just that thinking bigger and scoping the problem. And those are the two big differences.
Perfect. So in a recent discussion around the BC cluster on Monday, we said what the cluster would look like. The question came up of how to gain global market share, how to access global markets, and what the role of the government is in this. So we've heard the opinion that government should get out of the way. We've heard the opinion that government needs to be really involved as far as accessing market, accessing capital, or being a customer. What are your views on that? What is the role of government in this, besides the trigger and the carrot?
So I can just make a couple of comments based on our experience, and this is not from a financial perspective at all, but for us, we are a domestic-based investor. Most of our investment team is here in Vancouver, but we look to deploy capital in innovative, disruptive companies, not only across Canada and within North America, but internationally. We have 2 portfolio companies overseas, and government has been really a great touch point for us through the consulate network to, inform and educate other startup hubs around the world about Pangaea and the work that we do, also connect with entrepreneurs and innovators around the world, and also folks that are looking to either bring technology into Canada and think about Canada as a new market, and also help connect us with other capital and build out syndicates and co-invest and fund the companies that we're in.
So it's a really good question. So Minister Baines was talking about in the next few months, his government's going to roll out $800 million in funding over the next 3 years, and that's a lot of money. And so I'm pretty happy about hearing this kind of stuff. What I'm hoping for is not this peanut butter approach. I don't want this money to be spread over every single industry. And if my industry gets squashed because of it, well, it gets squashed because of it. But I really want it to kind of be strategic and really figure out what's BC's strategic approach here for climate change, and where should that money be allocated, and pick some horses to ride, and then really focus on and take an active approach on seeing who you left behind. And if someone that you left behind shouldn't be left behind, then figure out how to deal with those errors in judgment that you made, because for sure you're going to make errors in judgment.
Interesting, thank you.
Just very quickly add that two things that maybe governments can do is de-risk the first of its kind, and also incorporate some of these new solutions into their own operations. So procurement and the greening of government operations, for example, I think is a huge opportunity here in BC, but also in Canada in general. I mean, if you think about assets like parkades and cars, these are assets that are passive 90+% of the time. So at UBC, we have this large parkade which fills up at 9 in the morning and stays full until 5 p.m., and the cars and the parkade are just sitting there. Now, if you think about that, each car ranges from 60 to 100 kilowatts, the power plant that you have in the car. If those were electric vehicles, and if the parkade was a DC building, and if you had the right power conversion technology, could you start looking at those civil infrastructure assets playing a role in the energy system? So could you, in the case of our university, we are growing, and very soon we will have to do very intelligent energy management to solve some of the energy demands during peak times. So can we think of technologies that can reversibly and transparently perform those transactions? That's one area. The other one is data centers. We heard Premier Clark talking about data and privacy and security issues for the data centers in Canada. Well, again, maybe not in Canada so much, but in some parts of the world, the natural gas grid is 10 times more reliable than the electrical grid. So powering data centers with natural gas with a low or zero carbon closed loop system may be another way to incorporate some of Canada's most valuable assets, the electrical and the gas grid, into whole new solutions. From a product development perspective, data centers are really interesting because instead of having to develop an iPhone that has to be marketed to the entire world, there are probably 12 large customers for data centers. Data centers right now consume single digits in terms of the percentage electricity around the world, but that number is going to climb up very soon. And we are getting to the point where data center owners or operators by default now are power plant operators, because you have to build the power plant next to the data center. Now, if you think about that, you have the energy asset and the digital asset. Could we add a delay of a few milliseconds in your Google search, which you will probably even notice, so that we can dynamically reroute the request to places so we can eliminate one of the redundant servers that Google has right now, thereby lowering our energy and cooling, more importantly, consumption. So, there are some really great opportunities for government to play a role in.
Interesting.
So I wanted to echo Sarah's comment about government playing a role, introducing our companies around the world. And, this morning, Minister Verk called out our consul to Silicon Valley, Brendan Lee, and said, he can work on your behalf. And he said to me yesterday he's more than happy to introduce Cleantech ventures as they develop to investors in Silicon Valley and other companies and partners. So government can play a real role there, and with trade delegations. But also, I was on an innovation panel last summer with Xerox Research Center in Mississauga. I was Skyping in, and the other person who was Skyping in was Nagash Rao, who is the chief technology strategist from SBIR. And so he's been seconded there for 3 years, and his role is to go around to all the government agencies and say, what are your strategic priorities 5 years out and 10 years out? What are big challenges for your government department, the Department of Energy, all the different, the NIH? What are your strategic priorities 5 and 10 years out? And let's have a competition to get, basically an open innovation competition, except that it's, it's government funded through the SBIR program, first a competitive grant, and then it can lead up to procurement. And so I think, that's something that we could be doing. Again, it's focused on strategic priorities, so there is a market pull, and it's a way, though, of also having our technology meet those markets.
Awesome. So I have one more question, and I'll ask you guys to keep your answers to this short, because I want to take some questions from the audience, so like 1 or 2 sentences. But I'm the moderator, I'm interested in the answer to this question. So we've created a little microcluster up here. So if you could tell one of the other players, not necessarily exactly that player, but say, Ben, if you can tell the university something, or the investors something, the universities, if you can tell the companies something around this topic that you wish they would know, or think they need to do more of, or less of, or what have you, what would you tell them?
Okay, well, since I'm in the middle, to the universities, I would say listen to investors. And to the investors, I would say the big advancement in the Breakthrough Energy Coalition was patience. They have a 20-year fund that is their big innovation of Bill Gates' new fund. And it's not a question of whether the industries you're supporting will win, but when they will win. And if you can wait for 20 years, they will win in that period. And
You don't have to have an opinion for all of them. You can just
Okay.
pick a couple if you want.
Fair enough.
Thanks, Ben.
So, to all of the entrepreneurs and startup companies that are, trying to grow businesses and have impact, my question to you is, what's your BHAG, your big, hairy, audacious goal? And that could be something that's 15, 20 years out. And, be very clear on what that is and how you are going to stick around long enough in order to achieve that, whether there are early markets, other markets that you can access now that are urgent, that will drive revenue to your business and will enable you to be successful in achieving your BHAG.
Thank you. 2 sentences.
Okay. So for academia, I would say stay flexible and stay curious. We've done great work with UBC, SFU, and UVic with our co-op program and our graduate program, and I love how they're allowing us to be flexible with those students and getting them on site for their PhDs. For entrepreneurs, I would say reach out to your government officials. They're there, they want to make a difference. Take the initiative, find out who these people are, meet with them, and start a conversation.
Any university commentary?
Well, I would say to the technology developers, think systemically and listen to your customers and connect us to your customers, because sometimes the solutions that your customers are looking for are slightly different from the solutions that you as a technology developer are looking for. And that's a very interesting difference that I just started to pay a lot more attention to. To governments, take a long-term approach, maintain, create a clear and transparent platform, and we will deliver. I mean, we as I don't remember who mentioned it, Canada, that is, performs extremely well in the curiosity-driven and basic research. We are top 4% of all the papers, top 5% of most cited papers. But I think there is a disconnect between the scientific excellence and the economic sectors that are very relevant for, in Canada. So if you look at the areas of scientific excellence, they don't have a clear match to the economic sectors. And I think we need to make that link.
2 sentences. Okay. On the terms of the big, hairy, audacious goals, I like that, looking out and seeing what the scientist entrepreneur wants to do and what the new venture wants to do in 15 to 20 years. But also, I'd say to those scientist entrepreneurs and to those young ventures to be looking at what you can do in the short term to meet an unmet market need. And having that mindset will help us get a lot more inventions out into innovation and into the ecosystem.
Fantastic. All right, we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question? I think there's a mic coming around over there. So does anyone have a question for the panel? Oh.
Thank you, and thank you so much to the panel. This was really great to see the little micro-cluster develop on the stage here. My name is George Benson. I'm from the Vancouver Economic Commission here. We do a lot of work around clusters and thinking around bringing partners together, so it's cool to see something happen in live time around this. My question, I was so excited to hear a shout out to the FSB. I think the climate finance relators disclosures was a really interesting report, and there's a lot of interesting meat in there. I wonder if some of the panelists might just shout out some of the interesting examples they can think of financial decisions or financial vehicles that have been taken that you think have been disruptive towards in favor of clean tech. I would add the FSB report as a potential example of that, but whether it's an action by a private investor or a PFI or a decision, a declaration taken by any particular actor you can think of, I'd just be interested to hear where you're seeing some interesting decisions made. Thank you.
So I think that was, have you seen any interesting financial models that we could copy or that have been successful?
Well, I mean, this is very early. I think a lot of the instruments are just being developed, but the focus on mitigation funds is now the focus on mitigation solutions is now shifting to also include adaptation, especially in developing countries. There is the Green Climate Fund, is $100 billion per year to developing countries for solutions in adaptation. I don't know the details, but I think a lot of the large, Total, for example, we had an opportunity to listen to a presentation in Marrakesh. They are already doing this. So they are incorporating, I think it's $50 to $100 a ton of carbon as the price in their decision-making process. There is also, in Holland, a water fund. I can't remember the acronym or the name for it, but there is a water fund that is going to look at funding, a long-term funding for water solutions in developing countries as well. So there, I will be happy. I just don't remember all the acronyms and the names, but I'll be happy to talk to you later and to show you some of the things that have happened since Paris. And it's quite extraordinary, actually, the number of instruments that are being developed to basically bridge the gap from, the innovation gap, but also the product deployment gap, and incorporating different types of funding entities and players into that.
All right, fantastic. So there's follow-up to this already. That's always good. Does anyone else have a question? Sure. Yeah. You going to be loud again?
Yeah, I'll be loud again. I think it's wonderful that we as British Columbians punch above our weight. We're congratulating ourselves. But I'll be honest, I'm a little bit worried. I'm a little bit worried that we may lose this early lead that we had, especially as clean tech entrepreneurs travel the world. We see what's going on in China and the investments there. And so how do we maintain this early lead that we have? It's a question for the room and the panel. Are we deploying enough capital and sufficient capital to maintain that lead? Do we have the right regulations in place domestically to stimulate that market? Because China certainly does. They've made big changes and they certainly have the capital. So we have a great first lead, but what can we do to maintain it? Thank you.
All right, so how are we going to stay ahead and how are we going to win?
Yeah, I think it goes back to one of the comments I made earlier, and Ben, thank you, it was a great question for, I think, everyone to think about, is we need to think about the wicked problems, the core problems that are facing society today, not just here in British Columbia or in Canada, but what are the big problems globally, and let's come up with solutions to address those, and that will enable us to continue to have a lasting impact, not just here, but around the world.
Yeah.
I'll just very quickly add, I think it was President Santa Ono who used the term a collision space. And I think we need to create these spaces, because I have come up with so many ideas and I've been so excited and the level of enthusiasm in events like this is so high that may be a way of continuing and improving our position, is to maintain this excitement and to maintain this level of engagement just by talking to, it's very hard. I haven't seen Robert in a while now, but and we are in the same province, right? So it will be great to create this kind of space.
I'd agree with you both, and I think that I quoted President of MIT, Raphael Reif, before. Well, one of the ways that he's aiming to, as he calls it, get more ketchup out of the bottle, and I think they get a lot of ketchup out of the bottle at MIT, but he sees all of these contributions that they could make to society that are not getting commercialized because, as we've said today throughout the presentations, and we heard certainly in General Fusion, it's difficult and it's expensive, and there's a lot of technical uncertainty. Well, one of the initiatives that he did this year was to announce the building of a dedicated space in Kendall Square that is a collision space, of course, of types. It's called the Engine. And it has, its mandate is both to help people throughout the Boston ecosystem be able to de-risk technical challenges and do scale up and process innovation, but also very importantly to be a collision space, to be a place where industry come, where alumni come, where financiers come, investors come, and there's that market and technology matching process going on. And I think we could use something like that in BC.
We have 2.5 minutes, so sure.
That happened this week, and I've got to thank Paul Austin for this. So SCDC in British Columbia have collaborated to create a $40 million fund for clean technology. I think that's a brilliant way that we can maintain the lead. So congratulate SCDC in British Columbia.
Fantastic. Well, we can take one more quick question. That might be your way to end. Oh.
Actually, two questions.
So let's start with one, because we don't have much
start
time.
Okay, so now we are talking about creating the cluster and also the ecosystem. So for Cleantech, what do you think, how can you make sure this industry gets the buy-in from different stakeholders, from government, investors, including the consumers?
Okay, so how do we get buy-in from the different stakeholders?
It's a really good question. I like how Walter was kind of talking about this a little bit. It's a changing time right now. Like everyone's talking clean tech, from Globe to the Tech Summit. This motivation, this inertia is plowing us forward, and we're kind of on a collision course with a tipping point. And when we have the tipping point where people want to spend their dollars and choose clean solutions over not clean solutions, that's really where we win, you know. And so I hope it happens here. I also hope it happens in China. It's happening in China right now as we see it. And so I think it's that we're waiting for that whole tipping point where the consumer makes an educated decision and says, you know, I care about this, and I'll change my practices and buy a clean solution. And so that takes education. I think that's probably the number one thing is people understanding the problem. Like for the previous decade, everyone was talking about, is climate change a real thing? Now it's for once, thank God, a real thing. So I think we're starting to see it. I think we're all these people in this room here, we're obviously hoping or wishing it happened a little quicker. So I think we're on track.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the time that we have, but we've taken some very important takeaways from this, from the consumers to the investors to the educational institutions and to those young entrepreneurs and early-stage Canadian entrepreneurs that need to be thinking about problems that matter for the world and be the place to come to solve them. And so I'd like to give a big round of applause for our panelists for joining us today.